Hey guys, welcome back for another episode as we walk through the kingdom story experience, as we walk through the big story of God. The last story that we studied was that of the story of the prophet Amos. We looked at two different passages from the book of Amos where we were looking at corporate sin. We were looking at institutional sin, and we see that we notice that we have personal sin ourselves, places and areas where we continue to walk against the way that God would have us walk. But there's also a reality that there is institutional sin, that our institutions can perpetuate a type of sin that is oppressive to people, that keeps keeping people from seeing the flourishing of the city. While you may be a part of these institutions and inside you're working on your own sin, but are we working on the sin of some of these institutions? And we saw in the book of Amos that there were court systems that were practicing institutional sin. We saw that there was, kind of political areas. We saw that there were the rich and the poor, rich oppressing the poor. That was causing these different kinds of systemic and institutional sin. And God takes that very seriously. And there could be a case made that God actually takes institutional sin more seriously than he takes personal sin, because of what those institutions are designed to do from a heavenly standpoint, from a God standpoint. Well, today we're going to jump into the next story in our lesson, which is from the book of Jeremiah. And what has happened between the book of Amos when we read that scripture and when we come to our lesson today, our story today, which is in Jeremiah 29, quite a bit has happened. We see that Israel is no longer in Israel. What has happened is that the Babylonian army has come in. They have basically sacked Jerusalem, and they have taken everyone captive over into Babylon. This is what we call the exile of Israel from its homeland to the place of Babylon. And this was a divine judgment that God had brought on his people because of their sin, their continual sin. If you read through the book of Kings, 1st and 2nd Kings, you will see that as each king progressed, it seemed to just get worse and worse. There were a few kings here and there, both in the north and in the south, that were good, that would try to restore Israel to the grandeur that it had, to restore themselves to walk in God's law. But it never seemed to go on more than one generation. And the next king that would take over, they would just go right back into idol worship. And so God finally pronounces this divine judgment that Babylon will come, that there will be a kingdom that will come and ransack the city, ransack Israel, and take people over to Jerusalem. So where we see ourselves here is that Jeremiah has proclaimed, he was a prophet that proclaimed that this was coming. But now he's going to deliver a message of hope. But this is a hope to those who are now in exile. And there was much going on at this time, and people do not want to be in Babylon. This is a pagan city. This is their enemy. They do not want to be here. And there were other prophets at the time that were saying that they would be going home in 2 years. Well, then this letter from Jeremiah is delivered. And this is what God spoke to Jeremiah. And in it, when we'll talk about it a little later, but in it talks about how they're meant to kind of plant deep roots. They're meant to seek the shalom of the city, and in that they will find their own shalom. And this is a very timely lesson for me in my own life and some things that I'm working through. But the reality is that God seeks the restoration of his communities and his cities, the restoration of the entire world. Right? If we go back and you review the video of Genesis 12, where I talked about blessed to be a blessing, God told Abraham that he would bless him so that Abraham would be a blessing to the nations. And we don't see Israel living this out too much at all. And so here, God's divine judgment pushes them out into a pagan Gentile city, all the way over in Babylon. And here, in his letter, he tells them that they need to seek the shalom, the wholeness, I think of it as, if you remember those old school kind of devices that you'd look in and you can twist it and there'd be all these different patterns, or even if you look through a pair of binoculars and you have them out of focus, and you twist them so that they come in focus. It's kind of an idea of shalom. An idea. It's not perfect. We struggle to translate this, but shalom is basically the way God had intended things to be. And so God says to seek the shalom of the city. And I mentioned already, but our theme for this lesson is just seeking the restoration of our communities, the wholeness of our communities and of our cities. I mean, I pose the question to you, like, how do you seek the shalom of the place where you live? This lesson has convicted me time and time again that I want to be in the community in which I attend church, in which I work, because to divide myself and to live somewhere else, yet worship in this community, how do I seek the shalom of it? Do I seek the shalom of the place that I live, or do I seek the shalom of the place where I worship and the area around that particular building? Well, fortunate for me, I live in the city that I work. I also live in the city where I worship, and I seek the shalom of the city, because God said in that I would find my own shalom. And there's been a great peace in me, but also a great struggle in seeking the shalom of my own city and working towards its further restoration and its ability to reach out to surrounding cities and to be a light to them as well. And so that's where we're challenged in this lesson. There's a particular verse in here that Christians like to hold on to, where God says in Jeremiah 29:11, that I know the plans that I have for you, plans to prosper you and not to harm you. And that verse is something beautiful to hold on to, but it's also something to look at in context about what God was doing with the Israelites and what were his plans actually for them. So we're going to explore that a little bit and to see how God intended that Israel seek the shalom of the city so that in it they would find their own shalom. So our verse today, we start at the beginning of Jeremiah 29 in verses 1 through 4. And here we see the letter's introduction, where Jeremiah is saying that this is a letter from the prophet Jeremiah sent to the surviving elders and the exiles and the priests, the prophets and all other people Nebuchadnezzar had carried away from Jerusalem to Babylon. He's going to name some other places, and you see that these would be pretty prominent people within the city. I mean, so if you can think about your own city and to think that if we took away all of the police officers, all of the firefighters, all of the teachers, all of the politicians, all of the bakers and restaurant owners and those that worked in a supermarket, if we just took those people away, how might the city function? It probably wouldn't function that well, because some pretty key positions that maintain order, that provide food, and these different things have now just been taken away, right? So Nebuchadnezzar didn't take away everyone. He took away some key positions that he could then integrate into his society. But by doing so, he knew that there was no way that Jerusalem or Israel could come back to a place of flourishing, because he'd taken all of the important people. Not that everybody's not important, but he had taken away some key roles and some key positions that now things would be more likely to fold in on themselves than to flourish in Jerusalem. And so Jeremiah is saying in this introduction that he's got a letter and he has got something to share with those that are in exile, that are in Babylon. And in verses 5-7, God has some pretty startling words for those that are now in Babylon. Jeremiah's words to them from God says that they need to build houses and settle down. They need to plant gardens and eat what they produce. Marry and have sons and daughters, and find wives for your sons and daughters, so that you may multiply and increase in numbers. It says increase, do not decrease. Also, seek the peace and prosperity. That might be what your translation says, but really what it is seek the shalom of the city, which I have carried you into exile. And pray to the Lord for it, because if you seek the shalom of the city, you too will find your shalom. Okay, so before we even get down into verse 29:11, where it says, for these are the plans that I have for you, right? These are the plans that God is referring to. Build houses, settle down, plant gardens, marry, have children, have your children get married. What we're seeing here is we're seeing a pretty significant amount of time being talked about. It takes a while to build a house. If you're going to build a house, I'd like to live in it for a little while, right? To plant gardens and to eat what they produce. Time over time, when you plant more and more, when you have that crop, the yield can increase because you get better at it, right? To marry and to have children, to increase in number and not decrease. And through these things, so through the building of the houses, through the raising of these gardens, through the marriages and the life that Israel was meant to live following their God in this pagan place, were some of the ways that they were to witness and to seek the shalom of the city. They were to pray to the Lord for its shalom, right? I mean, how often may you pray about your own personal safety and well-being and shalom, but how often do you look outside your windows and pray for the shalom of the city? Pray for your neighbor that is bothering you because they're up so early in the morning working on their car out in the driveway. And it's just that if you're like, really? How are you doing that? How are you praying for the shalom of that? How are you praying against the crime? How are you praying for the homeless that are in your area? How do we pray for the shalom of our city? And these are people the Israelites hated. They did not want to be here. And God says, pray for them, because in that you will find your shalom. In verses 8 and 9, God gives a warning to them. And it says, do not let the prophets and the diviners among you deceive you. Do not listen to their dreams that they encourage you to have. Right? They are prophesying lies in my name, and I did not send them. So the Lord is telling them, I have not sent these other guys. See, the reality is that Israel wasn't planting roots there. They were planning to go home because they were listening to other prophets that were saying, you're only going to be here for 2 years. So basically, it's like they took their suitcases and they never unpacked. Or they were thinking about not unpacking because others were telling them that they were going to go home. And God was speaking to them and said, that's not true. They're not from me. I have not given them this word to speak. Do not listen to them. And then in verses 10 to 14, the Lord tells them, I have actually sent you here for 70 years. When 70 years are completed for Babylon, then I will come to you and fulfill my good promise to bring you back to this place. So God was very clear. We're going to be here, right? There are mothers and fathers and grandparents that have been carried off into exile, and recognizing that if we're going to be here for 70 years, that means I'm going to die here, right? I'm not going back home. Maybe my children, and for sure my grandchildren are going to be able to go back home, but I am not. This will be my home. I mean, think of the reality of us having to come to that this is the place that I will now be planted. God has moved me from Israel. He has placed me over in Babylon, and here he wants me to seek the shalom of the city. And then here it says, for I know the plans that I have for you, declares the Lord. Plans to prosper you and not to harm you, to give you a hope and a future. This future was going to live far beyond them as they're here for 70 years. God also tells them that you will call on me and come and pray to me, and I will listen to you. So this was a huge reorientation and a shift from what the Israelites used to experience. They believed God resided in the temple. They believed they had to go to the temple in order to really pray and to be heard by God. There was a high priest that needed to intercede on behalf of them. Well, their temple has been destroyed, and their mindset at the time was that gods didn't move. They were the gods of specific areas, and so God was the God of Israel. Well, now they're in Babylon. It seems like they're in another place where they're under a different rule of another God when they don't worship and they don't serve. But God is telling them, when you seek me in prayer, you will find me. Meaning God can travel. And we know this to be true because God is omniscient. He's everywhere, right? Omnipresent, sorry. He is omnipresent, which means he is everywhere. And he can hear their prayers at that time, but he's shifting this. He's reorienting their mind around what it means to be his people. And he says he will be found by him. And God reminds them that my promise is that I will bring you out of captivity, but not until these 70 years have been completed. God says, I will gather you from all the nations from which I have banished you, and I will bring you back to this place from where I have carried you into exile. And so this is so interesting about how, when we look at the character of God, because we have to wrestle with the fact that God sent divine judgment upon them. And God says, I sent you into exile, right? Now, they deserved it, but at the same time, it's Babylon didn't take them into exile. God is saying, I sent you into exile. And it's from here that I'm wanting you to spread the good news of my kingdom. It is here that I'm going to do a deep work in you of what it means to seek the shalom of your neighbor, right? To love your neighbor. God is telling them that I will be with you. I am present even in this darkness that you feel. But I promise you shalom if you seek the shalom of your city. What kind of God is this? That we could see that God so desperately cared about the growth of Israel, their understanding of worship, but he cares so much for Babylon as well, that he would send Israel to them to be a light and to be a witness and to share with them who their God is, to be ones that would plant gardens, that would build houses, that would have children, that would increase and not decrease. I think God comes across as so amazing in this story. One whose heart is for the nations, one whose heart is for the restoration of our cities, one whose heart is for the restoration of our own souls, knowing that if we seek him, we will find him. I mean, this is an incredible God that we serve, that on so many different layers and levels that he is seeking to restore us and renew us, repurpose us, and to reach those who are lost. And so I think by now it might be super easy to know what our challenge is this week. So our challenge is, how are you going to seek the shalom of your city this week? Is there an area that you can think of that you can pray over? I would invite you even to take a prayer walk to, like Joshua in the book of Jericho, the battle of Jericho, where he circles the city 7 times. Is there a place that you can walk around, a block maybe, an area of your city that could use the hand of God, and you walk around it and just simply pray? Is there an area that you can lend your service to, perhaps needs financing, perhaps needs a volunteer, and that you can be in that place to seek the shalom of your city? How might you think about reorienting where you live and where you worship to kind of come together, so that in the seeking of the shalom of the city, it's both where you live and where you worship, and those two things can come together and you don't feel divided? That's our challenge this week. As to how might we seek the shalom of our city. And remember, these are not just weekly challenges. My prayer is that they become deeply rooted things within you. And all the time, you're seeking the shalom of wherever you are, mainly where you're planted. But even as you go on vacation, as you go on a mission trip, as you travel the world, that you seek the shalom of the city. And in that, you will find your own shalom. So I hope this was informative. I hope this was challenging to you. Remember to like this video, to share it, to subscribe to the channel. I also invite you to look at www.thekingdomstory.org. And on there, we have a course, an Old Testament course. And in the future, we'll have a New Testament course as well, where you can dive more deeply into the stories that we're discussing today. I would love to hear your comments and your thoughts about this. What's challenging you? What is God doing in your life? Let's be in community. Let's be in relationship. And until we see each other again, I hope you continue to find your place in God's story.